When Stephen of Blois wrote to his wife from Nicaea, expressing concern that the crusade might be delayed at Antioch, he had no idea just how prolonged that delay would turn out to be. By the time 15 months had passed since the army's arrival at the city's gates, significant changes had taken place across the Muslim world. Much like the Byzantines, the Fatimids of Egypt had recovered from the initial impact of the Turkish advance even before the crusade began. They, too, saw the crusade as an opportunity to strengthen their position. The true power in Egypt was Shahnshah al-Afdal, who had taken over from his father, Badr al-Jamali, an Armenian convert, as vizier to the young caliph, al-Mustali. Al-Afdal sent a diplomatic mission to the Crusaders at Antioch, but it failed to achieve any agreement. While Frankish envoys returned with his ambassadors to Cairo, it became apparent that they lacked the authority to establish an alliance. The Crusaders had no intention of helping the Egyptians reclaim Palestine. Instead, they were clearly planning to seize Jerusalem for themselves. Recognizing the strategic opportunity presented by the turmoil in northern Syria, especially after Kerboga's defeat at Antioch, Al-Afdal launched an invasion of Palestine. At that time, the region was held by the sons of Ortok, Sakman, and El-Ghazi, who acknowledged the overlordship of Dukak of Damascus. As the Egyptian army advanced, the Ortokids withdrew within the fortified city of Jerusalem. They were aware that Dukak couldn't come to their aid immediately, but they hoped that the city's formidable defenses and the combat skills of their Turkoman forces would allow them to hold out long enough for reinforcements. Al-Afdal's army brought with it state-of-the-art siege equipment, including 40 mangonels. Despite this, the defenders resisted for 40 days until the city's walls were so severely damaged that they had no choice but to surrender. They were permitted to withdraw with their forces to Damascus, for where they later rejoined their relatives in the region surrounding Diyarbakir. The Egyptians took control of all Palestine and, by autumn, had established their frontier at the Dog River Pass, just north of Beirut along the coast. During this period, they also undertook repairs to the defenses of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in northern Syria, the weakening of Turkish authority was welcomed by the local Arab dynasties, many of whom were open to negotiating with the Franks. Even the emir of Hama, Ridwan's father-in-law, and the emir of Homs, who had fought bravely alongside Kerboga, abandoned any plans to resist. Of particular importance to the Crusaders were the positions of two dominant Arab families, the Munkadites of Shazer and the Banu Ammar of Tripoli. The Munkadites controlled the territory directly in the Crusaders' path, stretching from the Orontes River to the coast, while the Banu Ammar held the coastline from central Lebanon to the Fatimid border. Gaining their cooperation, or at least ensuring their neutrality, was crucial for the Crusades' continued progress. After leaving Merid and Uman, Raymond advanced to Kafrtab, located roughly 12 miles to the south. He remained there until January 16th, gathering supplies to restock his army. It was at Kafrtab that Tancred and Robert of Normandy rejoined him. Around the same time, envoys from the emir of Shazer arrived with an offer. If the Crusaders agreed to pass peacefully through his territory, he would provide them with guides and affordable provisions. Raymond accepted the proposal. On January 17th, the emir's guides led the army across the Orontes River, traveling between Shazer and Hama, and continued up the Sarat Valley. All livestock in the region had been moved into a nearby valley for protection. By mistake, one of the guides led the Crusaders into that very area. The local shepherds and villagers were too weak to resist, and the Franks quickly seized the animals. The commander of the fortress overlooking the valley decided it was wiser to pay for his safety rather than oppose them. The bounty was so substantial that several knights took the opportunity to sell their excess in Shazer and Hama, trading it for pack horses, buying up to 1,000. The Arab officials permitted the Crusaders to enter the towns and conduct their trade without restriction. While these logistical preparations were underway, Raymond and his military leaders gathered to decide on the next leg of their journey. Raymond was inclined to head directly west over the Nozeri Mountains to reach the Mediterranean coast quickly. Since Latakia was already under Christian control, staying along the coastline would keep the army connected to Antioch and allow for supplies to be sent from Byzantine allies in Cyprus, with whom Raymond had good relations. However, Tancred cautioned that securing the coastal route would require capturing a series of major fortresses along the way. With only 1,000 knights and 5,000 infantry remaining, the army lacked the strength for prolonged siege warfare. Instead, he argued, they should push straight toward Jerusalem, bypassing the coastal strongholds altogether. Taking Jerusalem, he reasoned, would inspire fresh reinforcements from Europe, and cities such as Tripoli, Tyre, and Acre would likely surrender without resistance once they learned of its fall. The counterargument was that the land between the Lebanon mountains and the desert was controlled by Dukak of Damascus, who, unlike some local Arab rulers, was certain to resist the Crusaders' advance. In the end, they decided to head for the coast farther south by passing through the Bucaea, the fertile plain between the Nozeri Range and Mount Lebanon. This route offered the easiest access from inland Syria to the sea. The army resolved to minimize delays and avoid lengthy sieges wherever possible. On January 22nd, the Crusaders arrived at the town of Masyaf, where the local ruler quickly moved to establish a treaty with them. From there, the army headed south-southeast to avoid the rugged terrain of the Jebel Helu Mountains. The following day, they reached Raphania, a town abandoned by its residents, but still well-stocked with supplies. The Crusaders stayed there for 3 days before descending into the Bucaea plain. Overlooking this fertile area was the massive fortress known as Hosn al-Akrid, the castle of the Kurds, built atop the hill now occupied by the ruins of Croc de Chevaliers. The local population had herded their livestock into the fortress for protection. Although the stronghold held no immediate strategic value, the Crusaders decided to capture it for its provisions. On January 28th, they launched an assault on the castle. Anticipating the Crusaders' behavior, the defenders opened one of the gates and released several animals. Eager to seize the livestock, the Franks broke ranks and dispersed. Taking advantage of the confusion, the defenders launched a sortie that scattered the attackers and nearly captured Count Raymond, who had been left isolated by his fleeing bodyguard. Ashamed of being so easily deceived, the Crusaders planned a more organized assault the next day. But when they reached the fortress, they discovered it had been abandoned during the night. A substantial amount of supplies remained inside, and the army decided to stay for 3 weeks while further discussions about their next strategic move took place. During this time, the Feast of the Purification was celebrated within the fortress. While Raymond was encamped at Hosn al-Akrid, he received a delegation from the emir of Hama bearing gifts and assurances that his forces would not be attacked. Soon afterward, envoys arrived from the emir of Tripoli, Jalal al-Mulk Abu el-Hassan of the Banu Ammar dynasty. This family, more renowned for its scholarship than military prowess, had preserved its independence by skillfully navigating between the Seljuks and the Fatimids. With Turkish power waning, the emir saw an opportunity to support the Crusaders in resisting the resurgence of Egyptian influence. He invited Raymond to send representatives to Tripoli to negotiate terms for the Crusaders' passage through his territory and even offered to raise the banners of Toulouse over the city. The wealth and flourishing condition of Tripoli and its surrounding lands deeply impressed the Frankish envoys. Upon returning to camp, they advised Raymond that if he demonstrated military strength against one of the emirate's fortresses, the emir would likely offer a substantial payment to secure the rest of his lands from attack. In need of funds, Raymond followed their counsel and ordered an assault on the town of Arka, located about 15 miles from Tripoli, at the point where the Bucaea Plain meets the coastal region. The crusading army arrived before its walls on February 14th. While eager to secure communication with the garrison at Lataki and access to the sea, Raymond encouraged Raymond Pilot and Raymond, Viscount of Turin, to attempt a surprise assault on Tortosa, the only suitable harbor along the coast between Lataki and Tripoli. The two Raymonds, accompanied by a small force, made a swift westward march and reached the town after nightfall on February 16th. They lit numerous campfires surrounding the city walls to create the illusion of a much larger army. The deception worked. The governor of Tortosa, a subordinate of the emir of Tripoli, was so alarmed by the apparent threat that he evacuated the town with his garrison under the cover of night. The next morning, the gates were opened to the Franks without resistance. Upon hearing of Tortosa's fall, the governor of Marquis, located about 10 miles to the north, quickly acknowledged Raymond's overlordship. The acquisition of Tortosa was a significant boost for the Crusaders, providing an open and reliable sea link to Antioch, Cyprus, and Europe. This unexpected victory stirred envy among the Crusaders still stationed in Antioch and compelled them to follow Raymond's march south. Around the end of February, Godfrey of Lorraine, Bohemond, and Robert of Flanders set off from Antioch toward Laodicea. Upon reaching the city, however, Bohemond chose to return, believing it wiser to secure his position in Antioch in case the Byzantine emperor launched a spring campaign into Syria. Godfrey and Robert of Flanders continued their advance and laid siege to the small coastal town of Jabala. While there, they received a message from the Bishop of Albara on Raymond's behalf, urging them to join him at Arca. The siege of Arca was proving difficult. The town was well defended and heavily fortified, and Raymond's forces lacked the numbers to completely encircle it. Tancred's earlier warning that the army was too weak to engage in serious siege warfare had proven accurate. Nevertheless, Raymond felt unable to abandon the operation. Retreating would signal vulnerability to the emir of Tripoli, possibly turning him into a hostile force. It's likely that the soldiers themselves were not fully committed. The surrounding countryside was rich and fertile, and supply lines through Tortosa had improved their conditions. After the hardships they had endured, many welcomed the opportunity to rest. In early March, a rumor spread that a Muslim army was on its way to relieve Arca, allegedly led by the Caliph of Baghdad himself. Although the rumor was false, it unsettled Raymond enough that he called for reinforcements from Godfrey and Robert. Upon receiving his appeal, the two leaders made peace with the emir of Jabala, who agreed to acknowledge their authority and quickly marched south to Arca. Their arrival was marked by a raid on the outskirts of Tripoli and several successful foraging expeditions across the Bekaa plain, capturing a variety of livestock, including camels. Raymond soon came to regret summoning his fellow leaders. For 2 months, he had been the undisputed leader of the crusade. Even Tancred had recognized his authority in exchange for a payment of 5,000 sous. But now, needing assistance, Raymond had to turn to his rivals. Tancred, unhappy with the situation and claiming inadequate payment, defected to Godfrey's camp. Neither of the two Roberts showed much willingness to acknowledge Raymond's supremacy. Raymond's efforts to assert control only bred resentment, sparking tension among the leaders. Their troops, witnessing the discord at the top, followed suit, refusing to cooperate and deepening the divisions within the crusading army. The tensions within the Crusader leadership intensified in early April when letters from the Byzantine emperor arrived. Alexius informed the Crusaders that he was now prepared to set out for Syria. If they could wait until the end of June, he promised to join them by St. John's Day and personally lead them into Palestine. Raymond was inclined to accept this offer. As a loyal ally of the emperor, he hoped that imperial support would help him reassert his leadership over the Crusader forces. Many of his followers, including Raymond of Aguilers, although deeply distrustful of the Byzantines, believed that the emperor's arrival might finally provide the crusade with a universally recognized leader. However, most of the army was eager to continue the march toward Jerusalem. None of the other princes were willing to place themselves under Byzantine authority. With public sentiment so strongly against him, Raymond's position was weakened and he could not persuade the others to delay. It is quite likely that Alexius never truly expected the Crusaders to wait for him. Disillusioned by their actions at Antioch, he had already chosen a policy of neutrality. For a Byzantine diplomat, neutrality did not mean inaction, but rather maintaining communication with both sides to benefit regardless of the outcome. At this point, Alexius was in contact with the Egyptians, who may have written to him as the Crusaders advanced toward their borders, seeking to know whether they were acting on his behalf. He denied any involvement in their campaign. From his perspective, this was reasonable. Bohemon's conduct had made it clear that the Franks could not be trusted, and Alexius had little personal interest in Palestine, which lay outside the imperial territories he aimed to reclaim. His main concern in the region was the welfare of the Orthodox Christian communities, for whom he was a protector. He might even have believed that these Christians would fare better under the comparatively tolerant rule of the Fatimids than under the Franks, who had already demonstrated hostility toward Eastern Christians during their time in Antioch. Still, Alexius did not want to completely cut ties with the Crusade, which might yet serve imperial interests. Eventually, his correspondence with Egypt fell into Crusader hands. They were genuinely outraged by what they saw as his betrayal, despite considering their own duplicity towards him entirely justified. They even blamed him for the prolonged detention of their envoys, whom they had sent from Antioch to Cairo. These envoys returned to the army at Arca just days later, bringing with them the Fatimids' final proposal. The offer promised that if the Crusaders abandoned any attempt to invade Fatimid territory, Christian pilgrims would be granted unrestricted access to the holy sites, and every effort would be made to support the pilgrimage. The proposal was immediately rejected. Despite the eagerness of the other princes to continue the march, Raymond refused to leave Arca without capturing it. To force a decision, Peter Bartholomew declared that on April 5th, he had been visited by Christ, St. Peter, and St. Andrew, who commanded that the town be attacked without delay. However, much of the army had grown weary of Peter's visions, suspecting them to be politically motivated and orchestrated by Count Raymond. A group of northern French crusaders, led by Arnulf of Rose, chaplain to Robert of Normandy, openly expressed their skepticism, even questioning the authenticity of the Holy Lance itself. They noted that Adhemer of Le Puy had never fully accepted it. In contrast, the Provençal faction strongly defended Peter. Stephen of Valence reminded the army of his own vision in Antioch. Raymond of Aguilers recounted how he had kissed the lance when it was still embedded in the earth. Another priest, Peter Desiderius, claimed that Adhemer had appeared to him after death, describing the torments of hell brought on by his earlier doubts. Everard, another cleric, recalled that while on a mission in Tripoli during the siege of Antioch, a Syrian told him of a vision in which St. Mark had spoken of the lance. The Bishop of Apt, once a doubter, said a vision had changed his belief. Bertrand of Le Puy, who had served Adhemer, testified that both the bishop and his standard-bearer had appeared to him and confirmed the lance's authenticity. Confronted with this wave of testimony, Arnulf publicly admitted that he was now convinced. However, his supporters remained doubtful. Enraged, Peter Bartholomew demanded the chance to prove himself through the ordeal of fire. Whatever the objective truth may have been, it was clear that Peter sincerely believed in his divine inspiration. The ordeal was held on Good Friday, April 8th. 2 stacks of logs, blessed by bishops, were set ablaze in a narrow passage. Clothed only in a tunic and holding the lance, Peter ran swiftly through the flames. He emerged badly burned and would have fallen back into the fire had Raymond Pilate not caught him. He lingered in agony for 12 days before succumbing to his injuries. The outcome of the ordeal led to widespread rejection of the lance's legitimacy, except among the Provençals, who insisted that Peter had safely passed through the flames but was forced back by the crowd, eager to touch his sacred tunic. Count Raymond continued to keep the lance in his chapel and treated it with reverence. The army remained encamped outside Arca for another month before Raymond could be persuaded to abandon the siege. The fighting had taken a heavy toll, including the death of Anselm of Riedmont, whose letters to the Archbishop of Reims had provided vivid accounts of the crusade. On May 13th, Raymond reluctantly gave in to the pressure from his fellow leaders. Tearfully, he ordered the camp to be dismantled, and the entire army moved on toward Tripoli. There were further debates about which route to take. Local Syrians told Raymond of an easy road through Damascus, where food was abundant but water scarce. The route over the Lebanon mountains had ample water, but was difficult for pack animals. The third option, the coastal road, presented the risk of ambushes in narrow passes that could be blocked by small enemy forces. Nevertheless, local prophecies claimed that the liberators of Jerusalem would come by the coast. Ultimately, it was this road that was chosen, not because of the prophecy, but because it offered the most reliable connection to the English and Genoese fleets now operating in the eastern Mediterranean. As the Crusaders drew near, the Emir of Tripoli acted quickly to secure the safety of his city and its outskirts. He released approximately 300 Christian prisoners held in Tripoli, compensated them with 15,000 bezants and 15 high-quality horses, and supplied the entire Crusader army with pack animals and provisions. It was even reported that he expressed willingness to convert to Christianity should the Franks defeat the Fatimids. On Monday, May 16th, the Crusaders departed from Tripoli, guided by escorts provided by the Emir. These guides led them safely along the hazardous route that curved around Ras Shaka. Passing peacefully through the Emir's towns of Batran and Jebel, they reached the Fatimid frontier at the Dog River on May 19th. The Fatimids had no substantial military presence in this northern region, aside from small garrisons stationed in coastal towns. However, their powerful navy could still offer some defense to these locations. As a result, although the Crusaders encountered no direct resistance on their route, they were also unable to capture any of the ports they passed, and their own fleet was no longer able to maintain contact with them. Fearing a shortage of supplies, the Crusaders pressed forward rapidly toward their ultimate destination. When they neared Beirut, the local residents, anxious to protect their lush gardens and orchards, offered the Crusaders gifts and granted them free passage through the area, on the condition that the trees, vines, and crops would not be harmed. The Crusader leaders accepted these terms and swiftly advanced to Sidon, which they reached on May 20th. However, the garrison in Sidon offered stronger resistance and launched an attack on the Crusaders as they camped by the Nar al-Awali River. The assault was repelled, and the Crusaders retaliated by devastating the suburban gardens. Still, they continued their journey without delay and stopped near Tyre, where they waited 2 days for Baldwin of Labourg and a group of knights from Antioch and Edessa to rejoin them. The area's pleasant environment, with its fresh streams and greenery, made it an ideal resting place. The garrison of Tyre remained within the city walls and did not engage. The army departed Tyre on May 23rd, crossing the pass known as the Ladder of Tyre and the Heights of Nakura without incident. They arrived outside Acre on May 24th. Following Beirut's example, the governor of Acre secured protection for the surrounding fertile lands by offering generous supplies to the Crusaders. From there, the army moved to Haifa and then along the coastal route beneath Mount Carmel to Caesarea. There, they paused for 4 days, from May 26th to May 30th, to properly celebrate Whitsun. While encamped, an unexpected event occurred. A hawk struck down a pigeon, which fell near the tent of the bishop of Apartment. It turned out to be a carrier pigeon bearing a message from the governor of Acre, urging the Muslim communities of Palestine to rise against the invading forces. After the celebrations, the Crusaders resumed their march but stayed along the coast only as far as Arsuf. From there, they turned inland and arrived before Ramla on June 3rd. Unlike most towns in the region, Ramla was still predominantly Muslim. In earlier times, before the Turkish invasions, it had served as the administrative center of the province, though it had since declined in importance. Alarmed by the Crusaders' approach, the inhabitants, supported by only a small garrison and too distant from the coast for naval reinforcement, chose to flee. Before leaving, they destroyed the great church of St. George in nearby Lydda, likely as an act of defiance. When Robert of Flanders and Gaston of Béarn led the Crusader vanguard into Ramla, they found it completely deserted, its streets empty and homes abandoned. The capture of a Muslim town in the heart of the Holy Land filled the Crusaders with joy. They immediately pledged to rebuild the sanctuary of St. George and to establish Ramla and nearby Lydda as a new lordship dedicated to him. They also planned to create a new diocese with its bishop serving as the feudal lord of the territory. A Norman priest, Robert of Rouen, was appointed to the position. As had occurred in Albara, This move did not involve replacing a Greek bishop with a Latin one, but rather founding a new bishopric in lands newly taken from Muslim control. The decision reflected the Crusaders' growing belief that captured territory should be granted to the church. Robert was left to govern Ramla, protected by a small garrison. Meanwhile, the Crusader leaders debated their next move. Some argued that it would be unwise to attack Jerusalem during the height of summer, suggesting instead that they march against Egypt, which they considered the greater threat. After some deliberation, however, this idea was rejected, and the army resumed its advance toward Jerusalem on June 6th. From Ramla, the Crusaders took the old road that climbed into the Judean hills, north of the modern route. As they passed through the village of Emmaus, messengers arrived from Bethlehem. The city's entirely Christian population pleaded with the Crusader princes to free them from Muslim control. Responding swiftly, Tancred and Baldwin of Loubourg rode across the hills with a small band of knights to reach Bethlehem. They arrived in the middle of the night, and the alarmed townspeople initially mistook them for part of an Egyptian force sent to reinforce Jerusalem's defenses. But at dawn, when it became clear that the riders were Christian knights, the people of Bethlehem flooded into the streets in a joyful procession. Carrying relics and crosses from the Church of the Nativity, they welcomed their liberators and kissed their hands in gratitude. As Bethlehem was restored to Christian rule, the main body of the Crusader army continued its relentless march toward Jerusalem, pressing forward day and night. Their spirits were lifted by a lunar eclipse, which they interpreted as a divine sign, the dimming of the crescent. The next morning, 100 of Tancred's knights rejoined the main army for Bethlehem. Later that day, the Crusaders reached the summit of the road at a site known as the Mosque of the Prophet Samuel, a hilltop that pilgrims called Mont Joy. From there, they saw Jerusalem rising in the distance, its walls and towers stark against the horizon. By the evening of Tuesday, June 7th, 1099, the Crusader army had set up camp in front of the Holy City. Jerusalem was one of the most formidable fortresses of the medieval era. Since the days of the Jebusites, its location had been renowned for its natural strength, which successive generations had further reinforced with human ingenuity. The walls that confronted the Crusaders followed the same path as those later rebuilt by the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, which still encircle the Old City today. The original layout dated back to when Emperor Hadrian rebuilt the city, and over time, the Byzantines, the Umayyads, and the Fatimids all contributed to their maintenance and enhancement. To the east, the city was shielded by the steep ravine of the Kidron Valley. On the southeast, the land dropped into the Valley of Gehenna, while a third, slightly less deep valley ran along the western side. Only in the southwest, where the wall crossed Mount Zion, and along the northern wall was the terrain favorable for launching an assault. The city's stronghold, the Tower of David, stood midway along the western wall, overlooking the road that climbed toward the Jaffa Gate. Though the city had no natural springs, its extensive cisterns ensured a reliable water supply. The Roman drainage system, still functioning centuries later, helped keep the city free from disease. The defense of Jerusalem was entrusted to the Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla. The walls were well maintained, and he commanded a strong garrison of Arab and Sudanese soldiers. Upon learning of the approaching Crusader forces, he took precautionary measures. He blocked or poisoned the wells outside the city and herded the livestock from the surrounding pastures to safety. He also ordered the Christian residents, both Orthodox and those deemed heretical, to leave the city and settle outside its walls, while allowing the Jewish population to remain. This decision was tactically sound. During the 10th century, Christians had formed the majority in Jerusalem, and although their numbers have been reduced due to the persecutions of Caliph al-Hakim and the subsequent departure of many, including most of the Orthodox clergy following the death of Ortok, thousands still remained. As they were prohibited from bearing arms, and their loyalty in a battle against fellow Christians was questionable, they were not considered reliable defenders. Their removal also reduced the number of mouths to feed within the besieged city. Simultaneously, Iftikhar sent urgent requests to Egypt for military reinforcements. Even if the surrounding terrain had allowed it, the Crusaders did not have enough manpower to fully encircle the city. They focused their forces on the more accessible sections of the wall. Robert of Normandy positioned his troops along the northern wall, opposite the Gate of Flowers, also known as Herod's Gate, while Robert of Flanders stationed himself to his right, facing the Gate of the Column, now called St. Stephen's or the Damascus Gate. Godfrey of Lorraine held the northwest corner of the city, stretching down toward the Jaffa Gate, and was joined there by Tancred, who arrived with flocks he had seized on his way for Bethlehem. To the south of Tancred was Raymond of Toulouse. Initially camped in the valley, he found the distance from the wall too great and relocated after a few days to a position atop Mount Zion. The eastern and southeastern sections of the city remained unguarded. The siege commenced on June 7th, the very day the Crusaders reached the city's walls. However, it quickly became apparent that time favored the defenders. Iftikhar was well stocked with both food and water. His weapons were superior to those of the Franks, and he further reinforced his towers using sacks filled with cotton and hay, which absorbed the impact of the Crusaders' mangonel bombardment. If he could hold out until reinforcements arrived from Egypt, the crusade would likely fail. Though the garrison was sizable, it was only just enough to defend the entire perimeter of the walls. On the Crusaders' side, difficulties soon emerged, particularly regarding water. Iftikhar's preventative actions had proven effective. The only clean water source accessible to the besiegers was the Pool of Siloam, situated below the southern walls, an area dangerously exposed to enemy projectiles. To secure more water, they had to travel over 6 miles, a journey made perilous by ambushes from garrison troops sent out to intercept supply routes. Many soldiers and pilgrims were killed in these surprise attacks. Food supplies were also dwindling, as little could be found near the city. The intense heat, swirling dust, and lack of shade made conditions even more unbearable for the Crusaders, many of whom came from cooler regions and were wearing armor ill-suited to the searing Judean summer. It became clear that a prolonged siege was not an option. They would need to capture the city through a swift assault. On June 12th, the Crusader leaders made a pilgrimage to the Mount of Olives. There, they encountered an elderly hermit who urged them to attack the city walls the following day. The princes responded that they lacked the necessary siege equipment for a successful assault. But the hermit was unmoved. If their faith was strong, he assured them, God would grant them victory. Encouraged by his words, the Crusaders decided to launch a general assault the next morning. Yet whether the hermit was mistaken or their faith fell short, the result was disappointing. The Crusaders charged with great determination and managed to breach the outer defenses of the northern wall. However, they did not have enough ladders to storm the walls in multiple locations at once. After several hours of fierce and determined fighting, they were forced to admit defeat and withdraw from the battlefield. The failed assault brought deep disappointment, but it also made clear to the Crusader leaders that more siege equipment was essential. At a council held on June 15th, they resolved not to launch another attack until they had sufficient mangonels and ladders. However, they faced a shortage of materials needed to build them. As it happened at Antioch, their situation was saved by the timely arrival of reinforcements from the sea. On June 17th, 6 Christian ships entered the port of Jaffa, which had been abandoned by the Muslim defenders. The fleet included 2 Genoese galleys commanded by the Imbriaco brothers and 4 other vessels, likely part of an English naval force. These ships brought food and vital equipment, such as ropes, nails, and bolts necessary for siege construction. Upon hearing of their arrival, the Crusaders dispatched a small group to make contact. Near Ramla, however, this group was ambushed by Muslim troops operating from Ascalon and was only rescued when Raymond Pilate and his forces arrived just in time. Meanwhile, an Egyptian fleet appeared off the coast and blockaded the port of Jaffa. One of the English ships managed to evade the blockade and return to Latiki. The rest were abandoned after unloading their cargo, and the crews marched inland under the protection of Raymond Pilate to join the main army outside Jerusalem. Both the sailors and the supplies they brought were received with great relief. Still, Timber for siege machines was desperately needed. The barren hills around Jerusalem offered little usable wood, so the Crusaders had to send out expeditions across the countryside. Only when Tancred and Robert of Flanders reached the forests near Samaria and returned with logs and planks, carried by camels or Muslim captives, could construction begin. They built scaling ladders, and both Raymond and Godfrey began constructing large wooden siege towers mounted on wheels and equipped with catapults. Godfrey's tower was overseen by Gaston of Barne, and William Ricoux was responsible for Raymond's. Progress was slow, and meanwhile, the Crusaders endured extreme suffering due to the heat. The Sirocco winds blew for days, affecting the morale and physical well-being of the men, many of whom were unaccustomed to such harsh conditions. Water became increasingly scarce. Many of the pack animals and livestock the army had brought perished from thirst. Some units even traveled as far as the Jordan River in search of water. The local Christian population was sympathetic and helped by guiding them to hidden springs in nearby forests. However, the Crusaders could not fully prevent ambushes by Muslim forces, whether from the garrison or from roving bands in the countryside. Tensions among the Crusader leaders resurfaced. The first conflict was over control of Bethlehem. Tancred had taken the town and left his banner flying above the Church of the Nativity. Yet the clergy and rival princes believed it inappropriate for such a sacred place to be under the authority of a single secular ruler. Tancred stood firm on his claim, and although public sentiment was against him, the dispute was left unresolved. A second debate arose regarding Jerusalem's future governance. Some knights proposed that a king be appointed. However, the clergy strongly opposed the idea, arguing that no Christian should bear the title of king in the very city where Christ had worn the crown of thorns and suffered. Once again, popular opinion sided with the clergy, and the discussion was postponed. The physical hardships, the failure of the assault, and the growing disunity among the leaders disheartened many of the Crusaders. Some chose to abandon the cause altogether. A group of them traveled down to the Jordan River to be rebaptized in its sacred waters. After gathering palm branches from the riverbanks, they made their way to Jaffa, hoping to find ships that would take them back to Europe. In early July, news reached the Crusader camp that a large Egyptian army was on its way to relieve Jerusalem. The Crusader leaders understood that they could no longer afford any delays. However, morale among their troops remained low. Once again, a vision inspired hope. On the morning of July 6th, the priest Peter Desiderius, who had previously claimed to have seen Bishop Adhemer after his death, approached William Hugh of Monteil, Adhemer's brother, and his own lord, Isord of Gap. He told them that the bishop had appeared to him once more. In this vision, Adhemer condemned the Crusaders for pursuing selfish goals and urged them to fast and to walk barefoot in a penitential procession around the walls of Jerusalem. If they obeyed this command with sincere hearts, they would capture the city within 9 days. Previously, when Peter Desiderius had described seeing Adhemer suffering in hellfire for doubting the Holy Lance, many had dismissed his words. But this time, the vision portrayed the bishop in a more noble light, and with the support of the Monteil family, the message was widely accepted by the army as authentic. Adhemer's instructions were carried out eagerly. A fast was proclaimed and devoutly observed over the next 3 days. Then, on Friday, July 8th, the Crusaders formed a solemn procession and circled the city on foot. Leading the march were the bishops and priests, carrying crosses and sacred relics. Behind them followed the princes, knights, infantry, and pilgrims. All walked barefoot. From the city walls, the Muslim defenders jeered and mocked them, but the Crusaders welcomed the scorn and continued undeterred. After completing the circuit, they climbed the Mount of Olives. There, Peter the Hermit delivered a sermon, followed by Raymond of Aguillers, chaplain to Count Raymond, and Arnulf of Rose, chaplain to Robert of Normandy, now considered the most powerful speaker in the army. Their passionate words stirred the crowd, igniting a renewed sense of purpose and unity. Even Raymond and Tancred set aside their differences and pledged to fight together for the cause of the cross. The spirit of determination endured. Over the next 2 days, despite the punishing heat and lack of water, the soldiers labored tirelessly to finish the siege towers. The Genoese craftsmen, led by William Imbriaco, were invaluable, and even the elderly and women assisted by sewing oxhide and camel hide coverings onto exposed parts of the wooden structures, shielding them from the Greek fire used by the defenders. By July 10th, the siege towers were completed. One was positioned at the northern wall, another on Mount Zion, and a third, slightly smaller, at the northwestern corner of the city's defenses. Construction had been carried out in concealed locations, hidden from the view of Jerusalem's garrison. When the towers suddenly appeared, the defenders were taken aback and alarmed. Governor Iftikhar quickly moved to reinforce the city's weaker sections. The defenders launched a relentless assault on the siege towers, bombarding them with stones and hurling liquid fire in an effort to prevent them from reaching the walls. It was decided that the final assault would begin during the night of July 13th to 14th. The main offensive was to be launched simultaneously from Mount Zion and the eastern section of the northern wall, with a diversionary attack staged at the northwestern corner of the city. According to Raymond of Aguilers, whose estimates appear reliable, the Crusader army now consisted of approximately 12,000 infantry and around 12 to 1,300 knights. Alongside them were countless pilgrims, men too old or unfit for combat, as well as women and children, though no exact count was given for this group. The first challenge for the attackers was to move their wooden siege towers directly up to the city walls. This required filling in the surrounding ditch. Throughout the night and all of the next day, July 14th, the Crusaders worked to complete this task, all while enduring heavy fire from defenders who hurled stones and liquid fire from the ramparts. The Crusaders responded with fierce bombardments from their mangonels. By evening, Raymond's troops had successfully maneuvered their siege tower across the ditch to reach the wall. However, the defenders, likely under Iftikhar's personal command, put up strong resistance, and Raymond was unable to secure a foothold on the wall itself. The next morning, Godfrey's siege tower reached the northern wall, near the site of what is now the Gate of Flowers. Godfrey and his brother, Eustace of Boulogne, commanded from the top level. Around midday, they managed to construct a bridge from the tower onto the wall, allowing 2 Flemish knights, Litold and Gilbert of Tournai, to lead the best of the Lotharingian troops across. Godfrey soon followed. With a section of the wall secured, scaling ladders allowed more crusaders to climb into the city. Godfrey remained on the wall to encourage those arriving and sent men to open the gate of the column for the main army. Tancred and his forces, who had followed closely behind the Lorrainers, pushed into the city's streets. Seeing their defenses collapsing, many Muslims fled to the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque stood, hoping to make their final stand there. But they had no time to fortify the mosque. As they gathered inside, and even on the roof, Tancred arrived. In desperation, they surrendered and offered him a heavy ransom, placing his banner over the mosque to signal its capture. By that time, however, Tancred had already looted and desecrated the Dome of the Rock. Meanwhile, chaos spread through the city. Its inhabitants fled toward the southern districts, where Iftikhar was still resisting Raymond's forces. By early afternoon, realizing the battle was lost, Iftikhar withdrew into the Tower of David. There, he proposed surrendering the tower and a large sum of treasure in exchange for his life and the safety of his bodyguard. Raymond agreed, took control of the tower, and allowed Iftikhar and his men safe passage out of the city to join the Muslim garrison at Ascalon. They were the only Muslims in Jerusalem who were spared. Overcome by the intensity of their long struggle and victory, the Crusaders went on a rampage. They stormed through the streets, into homes and mosques, killing everyone they encountered, men, women, and children alike. The slaughter continued throughout the afternoon and into the night. Even Tancred's banner, raised above Al-Aqsa, failed to protect the people seeking refuge there. At dawn the next day, a group of Crusaders forced their way into the mosque and massacred everyone inside. Later that morning, when Raymond of Aguilers visited the Temple Mount, he described wading through blood and corpses that reached to his knees. The Jews of Jerusalem gathered in their main synagogue, seeking refuge. However, they were accused of aiding the Muslims and were shown no mercy. The synagogue was set ablaze, and all inside were burned alive. The massacre at Jerusalem left a deep and lasting impression across the world. While the exact number of those killed remains unknown, the event effectively emptied the city of its Muslim and Jewish populations. Even among the Christians, many were appalled by the scale of the violence. Among the Muslims, who had previously been willing to accept the Franks as just another force in the complex political landscape of the region, there emerged a firm resolve that the Franks must be expelled. This brutal demonstration of Christian fanaticism reignited Islamic fervor. In the years that followed, when more pragmatic Latin leaders in the East attempted to build cooperation between Christians and Muslims, the memory of the massacre continued to stand as an insurmountable obstacle. Once no more Muslims remained to be killed, the leaders of the crusade proceeded in solemn procession through the empty Christian quarter. Abandoned since Iftikhar had forced its residents into exile, and offered their thanks to God at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. On July 17th, they gathered to choose a ruler for the newly conquered city. The man most of them would have preferred for the position was no longer alive. The entire army mourned that Bishop Edhemer of Lupui had not lived to witness the fulfillment of the cause he had championed. Yet many found it hard to believe he had not, in some way, seen it. Several soldiers swore that during the final assault, they had seen a warrior in the front lines who bore the unmistakable features of the bishop. Others, too, who would have rejoiced in the victory, did not live to hear of it. Simeon, the patriarch of Jerusalem, had died only a few days earlier while in exile on the island of Cyprus. Far away in Italy, the very founder of the crusade lay gravely ill. On July 29, 1099, 2 weeks after his soldiers had captured the holy city, but before news of the victory could reach him, Pope Urban II passed away in Rome.